Culture also at Tsinghua University. Daniel was educated at McGill and Oxford, taught at Singapore, Hong Kong, and he has been in China for 10 years. As you can see from his CV, which has been distributed this morning, Daniel has published widely in the field of political theory and political philosophy, and today he's going to talk about his latest book, which is titled The China Model. So, Daniel, thank you for taking the time to come all the way to Newark. And so you speak for 30, 35, 40 minutes, and then we can have a short conversation for 20 or 30 minutes or so.
Thank you so much for having me. Jean-Marc is an old friend, so it was a special pleasure to come here. And I didn't realize there's such a beautiful building here, and I had heard about Newark as a city in decline, and I said, wow,
it's getting better.
Yeah, quite beautiful. And maybe I didn't see the other parts, but
we can do that. We can show it to you.
So I've been teaching in Beijing for 12 years, and much of this book is directly inspired by my experience teaching and working there, and just talking to people, academics, political people, business people, artists, and Beijing is an exciting place to be if you speak the language and you interact with people from different forms of life. And the leading political ideals in Beijing are quite different than the leading political ideals in the US. I mean, I don't think that's a very controversial claim to make. And what I try to do in this book is try to articulate and make coherent, let's say more systematic, what those leading political ideals are, and use that as a standard for evaluating the political reality in Beijing, or in China especially. And we can talk about to what extent these sorts of ideas apply here or may not apply, but I do think that if we want to understand China, it's very important to understand it on the basis of its own terms, its own history, its own culture, of course with some interaction with other cultures as well, and other societies, but nonetheless, at minimum, the ideals embedded in Chinese history, and I think that are being revived today, are important for understanding the Chinese political system, both the way it's evolved and arguably the standards that should be used for evaluating further political progress and regress. So what gave me this idea to write this kind of book? Well, there's two things. One is just a more personal thing that, I've been at Tsinghua, as mentioned, for 11 years or 12 years, and I noticed that over the course of these years, more and more of the high-achieving students were being actively recruited in this party. We can call it party, but think of the Chinese Communist Party as a huge organization. It's 88 million people, extremely diverse. I teach in the philosophy department. I have socialists, liberals, Confucians are all members of this Communist Party. Think of it as this huge organization which is really aims to select and co-opt the elites from different sectors of society. And more there's this emphasis on this kind of meritocratic process of selection. And it wasn't true in the 1980s. In the 1980s, many of the high-performing students actively shunned the party. It was viewed as, that's not where the talented people go. But there's been this shift now. More and more of the high-performing students, not all, of course, but more and more are being actively recruited in this organization. I thought, that's kind of interesting. It's becoming more meritocratic, to use that language. Another interesting phenomenon is that I had been more working on Chinese philosophy, especially Confucianism, but more in a kind of theoretical sense. And basically, I'm simplifying here, but as the dominant political tradition in China is really this idea of political meritocracy, which I define as the idea that a political system should aim to select and promote political leaders with superior qualities, superior intellectual virtues, superior social skills, and superior ethical virtues. And throughout Chinese history, there's constant arguments over what those qualities should be and how best to assess those qualities. And you probably know, for better or worse, China's great contribution to the rest of the world in terms of education and political system is, what are the things you do at the end of term? You write what? No? Not just reports.
Exams.
Exams. Where does that come from? The whole idea of exams was invented, promoted, institutionalized in China, and then it gradually spread to the rest of the world. Including recruitment of the civil service in the UK, 19th century. Originally, if you're from like a landed aristocracy, or you have friends who went to Oxford with you, you could promote them into the civil service. But they learned from China. So hey, hold on a second. Let's have a more fair system and more open system for selecting civil servants. And gradually, the civil service examination system was implemented in direct response to learning from China. In China, though, there's never been this key distinction between selecting civil servants and selecting political officials, right? Both in the UK and here to a certain extent, and Canada, where I'm from, there's a kind of dual track. Use exams and more meritocratic processes to select civil servants, and they're supposed to implement the decisions of leaders, but the leaders we're supposed to choose through democratic elections, right? So it's two systems. You have democracy at the top. These guys are selected by the people or elected by the people through elections. And then you have civil servants who are supposed to implement the decisions of elected politicians, and they're meritocratically selected. In China, there's never been this dual track. In Chinese imperial history, for most of Chinese imperial history, let's say from basically I'm simplifying here, but from the 9th century all the way till the early 20th century, when the whole examination system collapsed, there was at first you went into politics through an examination process, and then you were evaluated at lower levels of government, and if you had good performance, then you would be promoted. And there was no separate track for civil. Theoretically, in Imperial China, the emperor had all the power, but of course, in practice, the emperor didn't have all the power. Right? In a huge country, you never have one person who can control everything. And it's these public officials who were selected through examinations and then performance evaluations at lower levels of government who often exercised a great deal of political power. And there was no distinction between a civil servant and someone who exercised political power. So I had been reading about this and the philosophy of it, but the interesting part is that over the past 30 years, the more I began to look at the Chinese political reality, and the more I began reading and speaking to people in public administration in China, the more it seemed fascinating that this old imperial system has been reestablished in form. How do you get into politics in China? Now, first through these hugely competitive examinations, literally like one spot for thousands of applicants, and then evaluated based on performance at lower levels of government. The same system that you had in Imperial China in form was reestablished. That's quite fascinating, and it wasn't widely. Oh.
A question.
Yes, sir.
And what is the content of the exam today?
So that's
because you mentioned that in the 19th century the traditional exam system collapsed, and it had partly to do with the content of the exam itself at the time, because Chinese knowledge was viewed as not as legitimate as Western knowledge. So today, what is the content of these exams?
Okay. So in Imperial China, let's say, at least in the Ming and Qing dynasties, the last two dynasties, it was mainly focused on the Confucian classics. And as you suggested, that was viewed as not appropriate form of education for the modern world. What they didn't realize, though, is that when the whole examination system was abolished in 1905, it was so deeply embedded in the whole imperial system that it's not a coincidence that the whole imperial system collapsed a few years later. You couldn't have the imperial system without the examination system. So the examinations have been revived, but as you say, with a different content. And now they're more like high-level IQ tests. I've read them, they're extremely hard. I would definitely fail, no joke. I mean, and it's really designed to filter out those who don't have superior analytical abilities. I mean, that's really what, there's some questions about propaganda, you know, what the history of the Communist Party, those are easy to answer, anybody could answer those. But the hard part is these high-level, you know, really difficult questions that are more like IQ tests. So they're more like meant to deselect those without superior analytical abilities. But they're often criticized, including by Confucians today, who say that we need more Confucian content because, you know, part of the point of examinations isn't just to deselect those without superior intellectual ability, but also to promote certain ways of thinking and Confucian tradition has a lot of resources for helping to make political leaders think in a morally justified way about policy making. You know, how to improve morally informed political judgment. Confucianism has a rich discourse on this topic. So many Confucian scholars today are criticizing the exams for saying they're too narrowly focused on intellectual ability and this Marxist stuff that nobody believes in anymore, we should get rid of it and we actually have more of this traditional content. Not completely, but have more of it. But again, that's only the first step, right? It's not sufficient. In the Song Dynasty, there was a little period in Chinese history where if you performed well at the examinations at the highest levels in Beijing, you were directly given a top political post. But for most of Chinese imperial history, and now, it's not sufficient. You have to prove yourself by performing well at lower levels of government. And what that has meant over the last 30 years is, and this is different from Chinese imperial history, is promoting economic growth in one's district. Why? Because there is basic consensus that the key thing for Chinese politics is to focus on poverty reduction. The best way of reducing poverty is to have high rates of economic growth, so therefore public officials should be promoted according to how well they do at promoting economic growth in their districts. And that's part of the reason why you've had this huge, you know, literally up to 500 million people lifted out of poverty over the past 30 years. You know, of course, you have many other reasons, more free market, energizes the people, and so on, but the whole thing was overseen by this political system that promoted officials, at least partly based on whether they succeeded in promoting economic growth. So that's different from pure history, and it helps to explain also China's, you know, literally, we can call it economic miracle. Tons of problems in China. The environment is terrible, huge gap between rich and poor, corruption, you know, lots of problems, but we have to recognize that one thing that has been, you know, literally, amazingly well, is poverty reduction. That's direct product, I think, of the political system. Also, it's worth noting, China hasn't gone to war since 1979, right? Not a bad track record overall, right? No war. I mean, think of the U.S. I'm Canadian. It's easy for me to criticize the U.S., but you know, no war, and 500 million people lifted out of poverty. I mean, that sounds, you know, if you look at the span of human history, not a bad achievement. And again, I think directly related to the political system. So once I began to think about how these political ideals are becoming re-institutionalized in modern Chinese political system, I wrote about this in some newspapers, and I was, you know, ruthlessly criticized by my liberal friends who said that, who's this, you know, here we can say gringo, or, you know, this Westerner who's apologizing for the Communist Party, what's that about? And what was more surprising to me was my Confucian friends also said, you know, what's wrong with this guy? He used to be thinking about Confucian philosophy, now he's defending the Chinese political system. I said, no.
But also in the West, you were labeled as an apologist.
Right, yeah. Well, yeah. So what I did is I took a 2-year break from writing for newspapers and just decided to write a book, which I hope has much more nuance, qualification, elaboration, where I can lay out my argument in a more systematic way, and I won't be viewed as an apologist. And basically, what I do defend in the book is an ideal. It's an ideal which is partly embedded in the reality and which I think has inspired political change in China. But there's still a huge gap between the reality and the ideal. But basically, I'm defending this ideal, which is deeply embedded in Chinese political culture and which has inspired political change over the past 3 decades. And when we think of political change, we really have to lay aside this assumption that only democratic elections count as political reform. That's why when you read the Western media, the standard trope is lots of economic reform in China, no political reform in China. Why do they say that? Because they only use one standard as political reform, which is democratic elections for selecting leaders. No democratic elections, therefore no political reform. It's a ridiculous assumption when you think about it, but that's basically what motivates this view. Set aside that view, and then turns out there's been a lot of political reform, namely this re-establishment of this old system of the selection and promotion of rulers, examinations followed by performance evaluations. But there's still a large gap between the reality and the ideal. So let me just, I don't want to spend too much time talking because I really want to hear your views, but let me just say briefly what is the ideal, and then use that as a standard for evaluating the reality and just suggest ways in which the ideal needs to be improved. Basically, I begin with 2 assumptions that I don't think are very controversial. The first is that democracy is a good thing, right? Does anybody want to argue against that? That nobody wants to be ruled by a political ruler who exercises power over us in a totally unaccountable way. Unless we're from North Korea, then we all want some element of participation, and accountability in the political process, right? That's not very controversial, right? The other assumption, I don't think it's controversial, but it's less spelled out in Western political discourse, and this is the view that political meritocracy is a good thing. And here I just mean that it is rational to want to be governed by leaders with superior qualities. Think about it. Intellectual ability. China's a huge and complex country, right? Policy making at the top is very difficult, complex, requires lots of empirical knowledge of economics, international relations, people's psychology, history. All these things are important. You want somebody at the top, ideally, who has, very good understanding of these things, as well as ability to process lots of complex information and come up with, informed political judgments. I don't think that's very controversial, right? You don't want, no rational person would want to be ruled by a truly stupid ruler who doesn't understand basic facts, in a moment of crisis. I don't want to criticize anybody in particular, but, imagine if, Sarah Palin had been elected president and then gets mixed up in a moment of crisis between North and South Korea and presses the wrong nuclear. But you want somebody to basically, have superior intellectual ability. I don't think that's very controversial. Nor do we want a ruler who is corrupt, right? Corruption means that the rulers are misusing public resources for private or family purposes, right? If you're an ordinary citizen, you don't want rulers who are going to steal our money, for their own purposes, right? You want somebody who at least is partly motivated by the desire to serve the good of the political community, and not just selfish and totally self-interested, right? I don't think that's controversial either. So, the question is how can we combine these 2 things? How can we combine democracy and political meritocracy? How can we have a political system where the rulers are there's some room for people to participate and some accountability in the system on the one hand, while also having a political system that aims to select and promote rulers with superior qualities. How can you combine these 2 things? And there's different ways of doing so. One way, and the standard answer in the West, is let's just leave it to the voters. The voters are wise and rational and public-spirited. They'll make good choices. You don't have to agonize too much over this question. Just leave it to the voters. The problem is that the recent social science on the quality of voters and much of the social science is done in the US, is almost universally depressing. The amount of knowledge, or lack of knowledge of the voters is just shockingly low in either, right? You can't just vote according to your economic interest. It's not like going to a movie where whatever movie you want is when it pleases you. You're choosing a political ruler who exercises power not just over yourself but over others, so you also want a strong element of public spiritedness, and that is also lacking among voters. And even more depressing, it's especially lacking among the wealthy elite, who are the smartest in terms of knowing their economic interests and gaming the political system so that it works in favor of their own economic interests. So there's a lot of evidence, in China people say, oh, well, we have low quality people, let's just wait till we become like the Western, where the voters are high quality. Turns out the assumption about voters in the West being of high quality is also not a good assumption. So some Chinese thinkers recognize that, and they've come up with different ways of combining democracy and meritocracy. One view was put forward by Sun Yat-sen, who is regarded as the founding father by both mainland China and Taiwan, and he suggested that political leaders, before they exercise political power, they should be elected, but they should also need to pass examinations. Not necessarily difficult examinations, just like driver's tests or something like that, And in Taiwan, the system was established more or less based on his ideals with a special examination branch that was meant to test political rulers. The problem is that system was never implemented. Because
before being elected or after being elected?
For him, it's first you have elections and then examinations.
And
if you fail the examinations, then you don't serve in politics. Now, you can already guess, what's wrong with that. Imagine if I get 80% of the vote, and Jean-Marc gets 20%, and then I fail the exams, he passes and he becomes ruler of our classroom. Would he be legitimate? No, right? I'd be legitimate, but I don't. So the system wouldn't work very well, because the person who has legitimacy is the one who's elected, and having examinations, even if it's simple examinations like driver's tests, would be very difficult. Like in Europe, I have an Italian student who's very frustrated by, she's not my student, but she's a doctoral student that I got to know in Singapore. And she's very frustrated by the populism in Italy. They elected Berlusconi, who's this very, billionaire, populist, but, a real demagogue in many ways, a bit like the Donald Trump of Italy. So she proposed that let's have a political system where before you vote, the voters should be tested on knowledge of two political parties. Very simple knowledge, multiple choice, 10 questions on each political party. That doesn't seem very demanding or, right? Just easier than a driving test. Just at least you should know, basically, you should have knowledge of the basic positions of two political parties before you have the right to vote. That doesn't seem so controversial. But it is controversial, right? For some strange reason, it's viewed as a kind of, curtailment of a basic right. So in the West, for some reason, once you have this one person, one vote, it's very hard. Yeah.
Yeah. In the U.S., there's a good reason why it's controversial. Because it was designed in the 1950s and before to prevent African Americans from voting.
Right. Sure. Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. So in the U.S., there's a special reason because of the way that this system has this terrible, nasty history was designed to exclude certain people. That's the reason why people would be even less, welcoming of this kind of system. But in another country that doesn't have this history, it's still a problem, just because, once people have the vote, they don't want to be, limited in any way, even if there's a good case for, having like a simple driving style test. I agree. In the U.S., the case would be almost impossible to make because of the history of misuse. Yeah. But even in Canada, maybe, where there's not that history, or Denmark, or Italy, it would be equally, well, not equally, but it would be also very, very controversial. So basically my point is that it's not a good way to think about how to combine democracy and meritocracy. It's like a non-starter. We have to think of other ways. And what are some other possible models? Well, one other possible model, and this is also an idea that has been put forth by some Chinese thinkers, is to think of it like two houses of, let's say, Parliament, or think of the UK system, right? Where there's the House of Commons, where there's democratic elections for leaders, and you probably know the House of Lords. The House of Lords historically was landed aristocracy, but over the past few years, it was really an attempt to make it more meritocratic, where you wouldn't be there just because of your birth or how much money you have or land, but because you performed well in certain sectors of society. So you have like high achievers, including in academia and in different parts of life, who would be given a post in the House of Lords. So it's really become a more meritocratic institution, and in fact, the debates in the House of Lords are much more high quality than the debates in the House of Commons. Much more deliberative, informed, less partisan. The problem is that the House of Lords, strangely enough, as it becomes more meritocratic, has less and less legitimacy, because the leaders are not viewed as being selected by the people. So it's becoming gradually marginalized, and now all the main political parties in the UK want to basically change the House of Lords to make it into an elected chamber, very similar to the House of Commons. Now, you might say, well, that's the West, what about China? Why can't we do this in China, where we have an elected house at the top, and then a more meritocratic house, let's say, where the leaders get there by examinations? And I must confess, that idea appealed to me, and I wrote about it and defended it earlier. But I now think that's not a very promising model either, for a very similar reason as to what's happening in the UK. That even if you implement this system, once you have it in place, the more meritocratic house is bound to be marginalized because it won't be viewed as legitimate compared to the elected house. So even if there's a very good case, like just imagine if there's a meritocratic house and they have the task of representing the interests of non-voters who are affected by the policies of government, right? Because one good thing about democracy is that even if it works well, it could do well representing the interests of voters, but it doesn't work well at representing the interests of future generations or people outside the country who are affected by the policies of government on issues like climate change, right? In the Canadian or American political system, nobody represents future generations. So why not have a more meritocratic house where they would have the task of representing, let's say, future generations? The problem with that is that once you implement that system, again, if there's any serious conflict between the two houses of government, which one's going to win, you think? The Democratic House is bound to have more and more power, and the Meritocratic House is bound to be marginalized. So this system of democracy and meritocracy at the top is also not very promising. The most promising model, arguably, is, and here it sounds a bit like an apology for the system, but again, it's defending an ideal rather than a political reality. We can call it vertical democratic meritocracy, and that's the model that has inspired political change in China over the past 30 years, but it still needs to be developed, and there's still a big gap between the reality and the ideal. And what is that idea? The idea here is that democracy works well at lower levels of government, right? At lower levels of government. And this is what Western political theorists have said throughout history too, right? From Aristotle, to Montesquieu, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. They all said, in a small community, the issues are easier to understand. There's more sense of community. If you make a mistake, it's not the end of the world. And people can deliberate in smaller groups. You can have high quality discussion. So let's have democracy at local levels. But as you move further up the chain of political command, the issues become more complex. Political experience matters more. If you make a mistake, it's very bad. If the Chinese leaders make a mistake about climate change or about going to war, it could literally be, the end of the world. If a little village makes a mistake, no big deal, So therefore, it's good to have democracy at local levels, but the further up you move up the chain of political command, the more meritocratic the system should become. The more there should be explicit attempts to identify rulers with superior intellectual qualities, social skills, and virtues. And that's more or less the political system, the political ideal that has motivated political change in China. With one caveat, which is that in between lower levels and higher levels, there's lots of experimentation because it's a huge and complex country. You don't necessarily know what's going to work in one place if it works in the whole country. Let's carry out experiments. in, for example, using different ways of promoting political rulers. In this area, we can focus on poverty reduction. Another area, environmental sustainability. See what works. And then, if it works well, we could generalize it to the rest of the country. So the basic model in China is you have, in fact, you have elections at lower levels of government in China, lots of experimentation in between, and meritocracy at the top. That's the model that has inspired political change, and it's a good model. But it has not been realized. And let me end quickly here just by suggesting ways in which there's still a big gap between the ideal and the reality. One big gap is that the system is not as meritocratic as it should be. In fact, at higher levels of government, not many people doubt the intellectual quality of rulers. You know, any people who have met the rulers at the city level and above are generally impressed by them. And, you know, at least the stupid ones are deselected, but there's a problem with virtue, meaning that there's lots of corruption in the system, right? And in a system that aspires to be a political meritocracy, corruption is deadly. In a democracy, corruption is not deadly because if the leaders are corrupt, you vote them out of power. You select different leaders. If the leaders are still corrupt, you vote them out of power again. And if the leaders are still corrupt, well, then it's the people's fault, not a problem with the democratic system, right? In a meritocracy, if the leaders are corrupt, it means the system is not meritocratic. Because by definition, being a meritocratic ruler is somebody who's supposed to have superior virtue. They're supposed to be, at minimum, committed to serving the public and not their own interest. If they're corrupt, it means that the system isn't meritocratic. So it's a fatal blow to the system. That's why now in China there is this longest and most systematic anti-corruption campaign in Chinese history, because if you don't solve this corruption problem, the system is doomed. So, in other words, the meritocracy, in terms of selecting and promoting rulers with superior intellectual qualities and social skills, generally works well. Not well in terms of virtue. That's where the focus is on. It's too early to tell whether it's going to succeed. I'll be happy to say more about that in discussion. The other part is experimentation. You know, for the experimentations to work well, who assesses whether the experiments are successful or not? Well, the problem now is that although the Chinese system, to be frank, is more scientific than like the American political system, you don't have people arguing about the science of climate change in China at the top. People listen to the scientists, right? In the US, as you know, many political leaders disagree with the basic science, right? Which is, kind of ridiculous. But, so in China, to be fair, you do have a more, efforts to incorporate a scientific perspective in decision making. But the system is still very politicized. And when it comes to assessing whether the experiments at lower levels of government are successful or not, it is often decided, at least partly, if not mainly, on political grounds rather than scientific grounds. So there's a need for more independent, expert, non-partisan assessment of the success and failure of experiments. Or to put it a bit in slogan form, there's a need for more science in assessing whether experiments are successful. Finally, there's a need for more democracy in the system, not just in terms of improving elections at lower levels of government, but also having other features of democratic values and participation in the system. Having, for example, much more transparency, more deliberation, more consultation, even democratic tools like deliberative polling, which there has been to a certain extent, even uses of referenda, those sorts of things are all fully compatible with a meritocratic system. The only part that's not compatible is one person, one vote to choose leaders at the top. Because what works about the political system now, the meritocratic system, is that you have leaders with long political experience, which is very important to improve decision-making skills at the highest levels of government, and also leaders who can take a long-term perspective, not always worried about being thrown out of power or wasting a lot of money trying to raise funds or giving the same speeches over and over again, right? So in order to preserve the advantages of the system, long political experience, long-term decision-making, you cannot have one person, one vote top, because that would really wreck the whole system. But all the other democratic values and practices that we know are fully compatible with the system. In fact, I think will become increasingly necessary in the political future. So to summarize my argument, there is this ideal which is fully, I think it fits well Chinese political culture, and also according to political surveys, is strongly supported by the people. This idea of democracy at the bottom, experimentation in the middle, and meritocracy at the top. But it's a as yet unfully realized ideal. In fact, there's a big gap between ideal and reality. It needs to become more democratic, more scientific, and more meritocratic. But my very important point, I think it's important, is that in order to assess what counts as political progress and regress in China, it's best to use this model, which is deeply embedded in Chinese culture and history and supported by the people, and not what we think of in the US or Canada as the only appropriate form of politics, which is choosing leaders by means of democratic elections. So I hope that we can have a discussion.